Hey guys, hope everyone is doing well. A few months back, I teased the thumbnail for the Exodus video I was working on and decided to take a brief pause on it. The Exodus video has proven to be a pretty big project, and originally this video was going to be part of it. And after looking at the mountain of evidence for the existence of Joseph, I decided this would be better off as its own standalone video. After all, we can't discuss how the Israelites escaped Egypt without first explaining how they ended up there in the first place. So with that short disclaimer out of the way, let's dive right into the video. The first step in determining if Joseph was a real person is recapping the story of his life we are given in Scripture, and comparing it with our contemporary understanding of Egyptian history to see if it lines up. For those of you who may not have paid attention in your Sunday school class, we're going to go ahead and recap the life of Joseph before we dive into any of the historical stuff, just so we have a solid background. The story of Joseph begins in Genesis 37, where he's born the 11th of the 12 sons of Jacob in roughly 1860 BC. We'll talk about where that date comes from in a little bit. Much beloved by his father, Jacob made for him a brilliantly colored coat, which Joseph regularly wore. Scripture describes that he was born with the ability to interpret dreams. His ability to interpret dreams, along with his father's clear favoritism for him, led his 11 brothers to become extremely jealous of him. This extreme jealousy caused them to hate their brother Joseph, and collectively they decided to attack and kill him. However, his brother Reuben wasn't entirely on board with this plan, and instead convinced the others to leave him for dead and dump him in a nearby pit. Later that day, after sitting down for lunch, Joseph's brothers see a group of merchants on their way to Egypt pass by. This gives Judah, one of the 12, the idea to sell Joseph to passing merchants as a slave instead. They retrieve him from the pit, and for the price of 20 shekels of silver, sell him as a slave. Reuben, upon hearing this, was greatly grieved, and to cover up what they had done, they took Joseph's robe and dipped it in the blood of a goat to make it appear as if Joseph had been killed by some sort of wild animal. They then presented it to their father Jacob, who, believing Joseph had died, was greatly grieved, saying, "I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Upon arriving in Egypt, Joseph would be purchased by an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer in Egypt's military who served on Pharaoh's royal guard. Joseph, having been betrayed by his own brothers and sent to be a slave in a faraway land, was only 17 years old at the time. In his time working for Potiphar, Joseph worked honestly, diligently, and built a very, very good relationship with him. But meanwhile, he does not forget his faith in God and still serves him dutifully. However, it wasn't only Potiphar who had grown fond of Joseph, because Potiphar's wife also took a liking to him. One day, she makes an advancement towards him, and Joseph, recognizing that he would be betraying the trust of Potiphar and committing adultery, turns down her advance. This causes her to freak out, and she accuses him of trying to assault her. This gets Joseph thrown in prison, where he remains for at least 2 years. Joseph, much like in his time serving under Potiphar, diligently obeyed the prison's wardens, and because of this was placed in charge over most of the prisoners there. Sometime later, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker are thrown in the same prison as Joseph. Seeing as their occupations were food service related, we can most likely assume that they were involved in some sort of conspiracy to poison the Pharaoh, and just to be safe, they were both thrown in there. One night, both the baker and the cupbearer each have their own concerning and cryptic dreams. When morning comes, Joseph sees that they are troubled and asks them what is wrong. "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them," they say. Joseph replied to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please, tell them to me." The cupbearer details having dreamt of a vine appearing before him. This vine buds 3 branches, each growing blossoms and then clusters of grapes. The cupbearer takes the ripe grapes and presses them into Pharaoh's cup, and then places the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph, after hearing this, tells the cupbearer the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place the Pharaoh's cup in his hands as formerly you did. I only ask that you remember me, and please do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh so as to get me out of this house." The baker then tells Joseph about his own dream. The baker describes having 3 cake baskets on his head, each filled with some sort of food. However, birds suddenly appear and begin eating the food from the top basket. Joseph then tells the baker his not-so-fortunate interpretation. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. The birds will eat the flesh from you." The events that Joseph predicted all come to pass, with the baker being hung and the cupbearer being restored to his office. The cupbearer, however, doesn't mention Joseph to Pharaoh, and for 2 years he forgets to tell him about him. It isn't until Pharaoh himself is plagued with a troubling dream of his own that the cupbearer finally remembers his promise to Joseph and tells the Pharaoh of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. Before summoning Joseph, the Pharaoh calls for all the wise men and sorcerers of Egypt to interpret his dream, but all of them are unable to. Pharaoh then demands that Joseph is brought up before him to interpret the meaning of this dream. Joseph quickly shaves himself, changes his clothes, and is brought out of prison before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I've had a dream and there is no one to interpret it. I've heard it said of you, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly, and emaciated, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows, and when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly and emaciated as the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are also 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown to the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. See, we have set you over all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, putting a gold chain around his neck. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your consent no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So just like that, Joseph is placed as Grand Vizier of all Egypt, and is tasked with preparing the people of Egypt for the famine. Sure enough, this famine comes, and when it arrives, the kingdom of Egypt is adequately prepared for it. So well prepared that people from other nations nearby travel to Egypt for food and lodging. During this time, Joseph encounters his long-lost brothers, who at first do not recognize him, as not only have many years passed, but he would have also been adorned with Egyptian makeup and attire, probably looking nothing like they remember him. Joseph doesn't reveal his identity to his brothers right away, and instead tests them to see if they bear any guilt for selling him into slavery. The scripture reads, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stayed with him. Then Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come near to me, please.' And they came near. And he said, 'I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord over all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have done do not come to poverty. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here.' Shortly after this, Joseph's family brings with them all their families from the land of Canaan, along with all their flocks and herds. Joseph is then reunited with his father Jacob, who is now in old age. Jacob declares, 'Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know you are still alive.' Joseph's family, with the permission of Pharaoh, settles in the land that is named Goshen in Scripture. Before Jacob's death, he blesses Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and afterwards proclaims blessings on all of his 12 sons. We'll look at these blessings in more detail later. After Jacob's death, his body is carried by Joseph and his brothers in a great funeral procession back to Canaan, where he is buried in a field that his grandfather, Abraham, had bought. The book of Genesis ends shortly after this and closes with the following. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.' Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, 'God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here.' So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." Whew, that was quite the recap. Now that we've recapped the story of Joseph and gone over the most important details, let's look at some of the claims it makes to see if it aligns with our contemporary understanding of Egyptian history, and see if we can figure out where in the timeline it would fit. The story of Joseph makes 3 central claims that we will be testing. That Joseph, a Hebrew, was placed as Grand Vizier of all Egypt, which, at the time, would have made him one of the most powerful men on the planet. Seeing as the Egyptians preserved their history very well, we should see some record of him. Second, that there was a great famine in the region at the time, one where Egypt was adequately prepared, causing different ethnic groups to migrate into Egypt. Similarly, an event as large as this we should see some record of in Egyptian history. And 3, a very large group of Semitic or Asiatic people settled in the land of Goshen, a part of Egypt during this time. Again, a large migration such as this we should see evidence of. Let's look at the first point first. Before we can even determine if Joseph was vizier of Egypt, we need to determine what time period he lived in and what pharaoh he lived under. In the Bible, we are given a date for the Exodus in 1 Kings 6:1 and 1 Chronicles 6:33. This date lands at roughly 1446 BC, during the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Therefore, because Joseph was on scene before the Exodus, Joseph would have had to live one of the dynasties before this. The first 2 dynasties immediately before this are the reign of the Hyksos, from roughly 1640 to 1530 BC, and before that, the Middle Kingdom period, from roughly 2130 to 1640 BC. First, let's look at the Hyksos. The Hyksos, who will be very important in our next video on the Exodus, were a Semitic people group, ethnically very similar to the Jews. The Hyksos would have undoubtedly been more likely to bring Joseph into a position of power than ethnic Egyptians would, due to the cultural similarities. Based off of this fact alone, it would seem like this makes the most sense, but the clues we're given in Genesis don't line up with this. For one, before going before Pharaoh, Joseph has his head shaved, and afterwards his name is changed to an Egyptian one. Being clean-shaven was a custom of Egyptian rulers, and not of the Hyksos, who, like other Semitic people, usually fashioned grown-out beards. The name change is also important, as the Hyksos would have spoken a very similar language to Proto-Hebrew. Therefore, it wouldn't have made much sense for Joseph to change his name to an Egyptian-sounding one if he was working under an ethnically Semitic or Asiatic pharaoh. Therefore, using context clues, we can be pretty confident that it is far more likely Joseph lived under a pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom period between 2130 to 1640 BC, before the time of the Hyksos. These facts make it more likely that Joseph lived in the Middle Kingdom period. To find out exactly what pharaoh he would have served under, we can look at the second claim we established earlier, that being that a great famine occurred in Egypt at the time, being approximately 7 years long. So, was there a famine during the Middle Kingdom period that we can look at? Looking at Egyptian history, we know that the conditions for years of plenty, followed by years of famine, occurred during the reign of Senusret III and his son Amenemhat III, both kings of the Middle Kingdom period. The historical famine that occurred under Senusret III and Amenemhat III began with the water levels of the Nile rising. At first, this led to great prosperity and an excess of grain. But in latter years, the rising water levels led to flooding, creating a national emergency for Egypt. This is something that is greatly attested to by Egyptologists, and if you'd like to read further about it, I'll link a research paper in the description. One of the things this flooding was controlled by was the construction of the Bar Yusuf Canal under the reign of Amenemhat III. Bar Yusuf directly translates to the Canal of Joseph. So, I mean, maybe that's a coincidence, but I don't know. We'll keep reading here. This name has been long attributed to the canal, and was not a later invention by Christians or Jews. Considering the Hyksos wouldn't have taken power for another century and a half, it would have been very uncommon and bizarre to see ethnic Semites in positions of power in Egypt, making the fact that this canal was made under the reign of an Egyptian pharaoh, but was named after the person of a Semitic name, all the more bizarre. However, there are more clues that lead us to believe that Joseph would have been in power during this time. Senusret III reigned from 1878 to 1839 BC, and his son Amenemhat III reigned from 1860 to 1814 BC. You may have noticed that there is some overlap in the times they ruled. Historically, there is disagreement over who had total control over Egypt at this time. Interestingly, all known statues we have belonging to Senusret III and Amenemhat III are missing their king's beards. Something very common for pharaohs to be depicted with, as it was a sign of sovereignty, only to be worn by royalty or people in positions of ruling power. This is interesting, considering we are told Joseph was given complete control of Egypt by Pharaoh, and that Joseph describes himself as a father to Pharaoh. Again, looking at their statues, they are depicted with unusual characteristics, both of which have large, outturned ears, symbolic of them listening to the cries of their people. They also have troubled expressions, showing that their reign may have been filled with strife. These unusual statues give us hints that behind the scenes, maybe something more was going on. Seeing as Joseph would have held the position known as vizier, what do we know of the vizier of this time? If Joseph really was the vizier of this time, we should see some parallels between what is historically recorded about the vizier and what is biblically written about Joseph. This is where things get a little more complicated, as there are more than one viziers recorded existing under the reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III. Of these are, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of these just to be clear, Khnumhotep III, Kheti, Zamoth, Senusret Ankh, and Anku. Seeing as Joseph was one person, and these are 5, is it possible that these different names aren't different people and are just different names for the same person? Let's take a look of what we know about these viziers to see if we can draw this conclusion. The first one we'll look at is Senusret Ankh, also sometimes called Amenemhat Ankh. Little is known about this vizier, except for the fact that he was appointed as an overseer of fields, and according to his statue found at Ugarat, the gold of praise was given to him in front of all courtiers. Immediately, we should see some parallels here with Joseph. Helping prepare Egypt for the 7-year famine, Joseph would have had a large hand in overseeing granaries and fields, just like Senusret Ankh is recorded as doing. Genesis also records Joseph being given a gold chain around his neck in the presence of all of Pharaoh's cabinet, just like Senusret Ankh is. Additionally, Ankh's name, when directly translated, means enlivenment of Senusret, or, if you use his alternate name, enlivenment of Amenemhat, depending on which rendition you use. This is strikingly similar to Joseph's Egyptian name, Zephaniah Pan Ania, which is likely the muddied form of the name Jedu Enef Panak, which when translated to English means he who is called the enlivenment. On top of this, we have no body or tomb of this alleged vizier to indicate that he is another person, just the statue that I previously mentioned. Without having a body, we are unable to definitively rule out that this was a different person. Before moving on to the next vizier, let's recap some of the similarities between Senusret Ankh and Joseph. Both Joseph and Senusret Ankh would have been appointed as an overseer of fields. Both are being described as given gold as a form of praise in front of royalty. And third, both of their names are some rendition of the word enlivenment when translated to English. On top of this, there is no known body of Senusret Ankh, meaning that we can't definitively say this is another person. Next, let's look at Khnumhotep III. To start, Vizier Khnumhotep has a tomb we know of, and inside, the name of Vizier Senusret Ankh name appears in the inscription as well, giving us good reason to suggest that Khnumhotep and Senusret Ankh, the vizier we just discussed, are the same person. Inside of Khnumhotep III's tomb, a body was found embalmed. Seeing as there is a separate body here, this gives reason to suggest that Vizier Khnumhotep is a different person from Joseph, right? Well, not actually. The inscribed biography inside the tomb reveals that although the tomb's original owner was in fact Khnumhotep III, the tomb was later on bought legally by someone else, indicating that instead of Khnumhotep being buried here, it is most likely someone else entirely. Another historical title of Khnumhotep III was Gate of Foreign Lands. Seeing as during the life of Joseph, many foreign people would have migrated to Egypt, this title makes sense if we apply it and compare it to Joseph. So, to recap, Senusret Ankh's name is mentioned in Khnumhotep III's tomb, along with the alternate names of Khnumhotep III being Gate of Foreign Lands. The next vizier we'll look at is Kheti or Cheti. Very little is known of this vizier, but what we do know for certain is that he lived under the reigns of Amenhotep III, specifically in the 29th year of his reign. The installation of the vizier, a papyrus text found in several New Kingdom-era tombs, mentions him by name, and says that, quote, he impoverished his associates for the benefit of others. Kheti was a vizier who put the people of Egypt before its ruling class, and allowed his associates, or the other members of Pharaoh's cabinet, to suffer a little if it meant the benefit of all Egypt. This 100% lines up with the selfless character of Joseph as described in Genesis. Additionally, we know of another Egyptian nomarch, or governor of the same name from the 10th dynasty era, long before Kheti would have come on the scene. Kheti I was a governor of the Upper Egypt region and was known for his work expanding the amounts of irrigation canals and cultivable land. Joseph, had he been real, would have been tasked with the construction of canals as one of his responsibilities for the oncoming famine. Could it be that this new Cheti was a nickname for the vizier Joseph due to him likening to Cheti I? Although we never know for certain, it is something to consider. On top of all this, we have no known tomb or bati of Cheti to indicate that he may be another person. The final vizier for the time we'll look at, with probably the coolest name of them all, is Zamonth. Zamonth we know far little more about than the others. We know for certain that he was an immensely powerful vizier. In his statue, he is the only vizier ever depicted wearing the king's beard. Now, if you'll remember, the kings of this time, Senusret III and Amenhotep III, aren't depicted in their statues as having this beard, which is highly unusual. This detail alone is enough to suggest that Vizier Zamonth may have been the one truly in charge of Egypt during this time. Harkening back to the story of Joseph, seeing as the Pharaoh in Genesis gives Joseph authority over, quote, all the land of Egypt, along with Joseph declaring that he is, quote, a father to Pharaoh, a clear parallel can be seen between the characters of Zamonth and Joseph. Many scholars believe Zamonth was the founder of a family that would go on to serve multiple generations of viziership. We know that he had a son named Anku and a wife named Anutsen. Anutsen's name is extraordinarily similar to that of Joseph's wife's name, which, if you remember, is Asenath. In ancient Egyptian, these names would have been written in the same way, and over time it's possible that the order of the letters could have been confused or jumbled. Although this piece of evidence is a little bit more speculative, it is something to take note of. Like most of the others, there is no body or grave attributed to Zamonth, proving that he could be a different person from the others mentioned here. Now, to quickly recap. Of the viziers at the time, we know about the lives of Senusret Ankh, Kunamutep III, Keti, and Zamoth, all of which bear striking similarities not only to each other, but to Joseph. We also have very incomplete and broken bibliographies of each of these people, suggesting that these 4 viziers may have been the same person, this person being the biblical Joseph. Before I believe we can adequately conclude that Joseph was the vizier under the reigns of Pharaohs Senusret III and Amenemhat III, we should analyze our third original question, and look at if there is evidence of a large-scale migration of Semitic peoples into Egypt at this time. The short answer, yes. Starting from roughly 1900 BC, we see more and more Asiatic immigrants, mostly Canaanites, trickle into Egypt. Over time, this number grew until it started to become a problem for the Egyptians with the advent of the Hyksos takeover. To reiterate, the immigration of Semitic or Asiatic people into Egypt is a highly attested historical fact, and I encourage you to look this up yourself. Now to recap. The biblical date we are given for Exodus is roughly 1446 BC. Therefore, if Joseph was real, he would have either lived during the time of the Hyksos or in the Middle Kingdom Egypt. Because of the details we are given in the book of Genesis, we can determine that Joseph lived in the Middle Kingdom period. To determine which king he lived under, and if the story of Joseph aligns with what we historically know, we should see evidence of a great famine and migration of Semitic peoples. Historically, we witness a large-scale migration of Asiatics, along with the flooding of the Nile, take place under the reign of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, which led to years of plenty, followed by years of famine. During the reign of these 2 kings, we also see the construction of the Bar Yusuf Canal, or Canal of Joseph. On top of this, we have also evidence to suggest that kings of this time experienced an unusual reign, not holding the same power other pharaohs did. This is realized by the vizier of the time, Zamoth, who is the only vizier in history ever depicted with the king's beard. The other viziers recorded as living during this time carry many parallels with Joseph and do not have any known bodies attributed to them. This, along with the fact that historically there are not usually multiple viziers in power at the same time, suggests that these many viziers were most likely the same person, this person being the biblical Joseph. The book of Genesis bears many parallels with what we know from our contemporary understanding of Egyptian history, and I believe from just the historical record alone, we can say that it is more likely than not that Joseph the patriarch was A, a real person, B, served as the vizier of Egypt, C, helped to save Egypt from a famine that would have otherwise decimated it, and D, helped to foster the large-scale immigration of Semitic or Asiatic people into Egypt, setting the stage for the Hyksos takeover and eventually the exodus of the Hebrew people out of Egypt.